Hey everybody, this is Abley Digital Engineering Team. Hamish, Todd, Gavin. We're going to be doing another Fireside chat today. Our topic's going to be on a locations of interest map that we released here in New Zealand. There recently was an outbreak of COVID-19 and we just came out of lockdown down in Christchurch. That's where we are, but Auckland is still in lockdown. One of the things that we did was we created a really cool locations of interest map to help with contact tracing, which is a very robust contact tracing system that we're using down here in New Zealand. Todd was on the front lines with our team here, and so we're going to do a little bit of background, what he applied with using FME, and maybe what he sees in the future with this same application.
So locations of interest came about because basically I got a call from one of the guys inside the company asking if we could release a web map with the known locations of interest for where people had been that had caught COVID-19.
So you make an interesting point there about a map. So something to note that previously, before this, there weren't really any maps of these locations of interest. They were just tabular with addresses. Yes. And times that people had visited those locations, either signing in manually or scanning with the COVID Tracer app.
Yeah, so this is basically a day after they had started putting out these addresses, these locations of interest with these date timestamps. I'll get to that a little bit later. But the initial request came in was that we had downloaded the data from an HTML page, we had geocoded it, and we were going to put it out onto the internet with these locations. Now, I kind of looked at that and went, how are we updating it? Because there's going to be more and more locations as we go. Yeah. And the feedback was that currently we hadn't thought about that we were just going to get this out there as just an example of what could be done. As Hamish mentioned, the data is straight, just tabular, so people were having to go through 100, 200 sites trying to figure out if they'd been to them with no geographic or no visibility to be able to see where those locations were. You'd just have to search all the places you've been to. And I basically was like, I can build this process in a few minutes with FME, and we can chuck it up on our FME server, and it can fire every 5 minutes. We were going to read the data with the HTML reader, table reader. We were in FME, we were going to geocode the addresses using HERE's geocoders, and we were just publishing up into RJS Online, which the map and stuff was going to be created in. Again, this is all very quickly, not really planned out, so it's very much building on the fly. Now, so I was like, yep, I can do this really quickly, I will go ahead and do it. And yes, I could do it really quickly. I could bring in the HTML table, I could geocode those addresses and spit it out into RJS Online. But when you kind of get into that, that's a very simple thing to do. And what we immediately found was not all of these things were addresses. Mm-hmm. So some were public transport. So, bus routes, train routes. So people had jumped on a bus who had COVID-19, and now that bus was a location of interest. And geocoding addresses is fine, but then we had to actually find the bus routes and things like that. One of the other things was that the date fields weren't date fields, they were text, entered text, and
free text, basically.
Free text.
So
usually not too bad, but they might say the day was the giving you the day, say 13th of August 2021, and then saying that in another column that it was from 11 p.m. to 2 a.m. So that 2 a.m. is actually the next day. And and the structure of that being free text meant that depending on who had entered it, they had used either like a colon or a full stop, or period as you like to call them,
or dash, or slash, or anything.
And just the way the different amounts of white space used in different places where the dash is used.
So lots of regex that you were
So
applying.
yes, lots of regex to try and break that down and figure that out.
Okay, so you've got addresses and you got times. In some cases, you have bus routes. You had the airport for a flight that went to Wellington.
So I'll talk about those kind of those public transport and flights and stuff because they brought up another problem in that they weren't addresses. So the geocoding engines didn't necessarily have them. So in this case, most of the outbreak occurred or is occurring in Auckland, and there was only a tiny little outbreak in the likes of Wellington.
About a dozen cases or something.
Yeah, and they've got all Wellington under control. And but there were flights, there were buses taken, and so we actually needed to figure out a process to convert what was written in free text form out to the bus routes and the train routes. So that wasn't too bad because we could get the bus and train routes, so Auckland Transport had them all, and so we had the digital form. So we didn't need to create the bus routes, but we needed to figure out how the numbers associated. And this is also goes beyond just public bus. There was actually school buses as well, which was a completely different data set. And so basically built out some logic to based on how people were entering them at the different times. And this has changed quite a bit because, like I mentioned, this table's free entry for the Ministry of Health in New Zealand to add to.
And even the data's evolved, hasn't it? So like initially, I don't know the exacts, but it might have just been this bus route, but then it changed from this stop to this stop at this time on the bus route. So even though you had the bus route from the beginning, over time that information that related to the bus route had changed.
So yes, sometimes there has to be manual intervention. Sometimes we won't be able to write a piece of regex or other process that would automatically do it. Most of them do. So a couple of examples is often they would start out if it was a bus, they would say it was either a public bus or bus, and then follow it with the number of that bus and whatever suffix it might have. And so we were able to use those to basically build a process that would then associate those bus routes.
So you created the web map and you push it up to
Abley. So had one of the guys building RJS Experience website, so relatively simple out of the box, and we just didn't also just create those kind of lines and point features. We also created documentation to fill out the website as well. So for instance, if we had a bus route come through that didn't match, and I would get an email to say
we would get an email.
We would all get an email to say that this bus route hasn't matched, and that would then include someone to go in and alter the script just to pick up that bus route, having to put in some logic. But also the website will report that. So if it might say 329 out of 329 out of 330 sites shown on the map as at
last update.
Last update, which is within the 5 minutes, and then it would tell you the record that wasn't up to date.
Oh, so it would just display the text.
Display the text and say this record
So
is
bus
not
route 1 from Albany to
And
Not sure.
and the tagline, we're working on it, which we usually were at all sorts of crazy times and nights.
Apart from that one weekend where
yeah,
we got 400 emails.
Yeah, there was something slightly different, but that was another thing. The FME gave us this great reporting ability because this data set, in terms of the table structure, in terms of all sorts of things, changed heaps.
Well, because it originally started off as one table, and then on the website. Then when Wellington got
two
location,
tables.
it went to 2 tables.
Then they renamed some of the columns, and then they actually implemented some of their own searches on the site, which then they altered some of the way things had worked in their HTML tables again. And then even recently they added a new one with a different structure than what the existing table is.
Yeah.
But all showing the same information, just represented slightly
Yes, slightly differently.
Yeah.
So actually having that process that informs you that something's amiss when you've got no control over that source data
was very helpful.
Very helpful.
And knowing within 5 minutes of the data changing as well was
cool. I was just going to talk about that component. So one of the things that we learned throughout this process was they actually had data coming through in a more compatible format. They had a CSV or a GeoJSON or something.
CSV and GeoJSON.
So theoretically, you could have hooked up to that data. However, we also learned that the most up-to-date information was that website with the tables that you're pulling from in the first place.
Correct.
And so what this application set precedence in New Zealand saying we keep, and I'm not saying this in a way that's, it was led to be trustworthy.
Yeah.
It updates frequently and it updates from the newest, most reliable source that we could find.
And the manual intervention size of it was minimal. So there were other maps around, and some of them were using manual interventions. So they were actually
the JSON and the CSV.
Yes. So some people were actually having to manually go and add all these sites, and then the Ministry of Health was also taking down sites after a certain amount of time. So
locations,
yes, and. Yes, and the GeoJSON, there was a GeoJSON feed which had all the addresses that they could find placed, and also a CSV. But like you mentioned, the updates on that happened after the updates had happened to the website.
And I can see why that was the case, because anyone can update a table. Table's really easy to update, but you probably need some some geospatial knowledge and process to update a JSON, the JSON file or CSV, not really, but if it's got a spatial component, you need to know how to correctly format and find your spatial location.
Yeah.
How do you see, and in the case of this happening again, hopefully it won't, how do you see this being utilised to effectively manage and manage the response?
I think one of the things that we've got to realise here is this process for FME is actually a really simple one, and we haven't done anything amazing. I mean, I would say we do stuff here that's more amazing on a week-to-week basis than this particular thing. The idea is just a simple one, though. It's about keeping consistent, accurate data and keeping it up to date for people to consume. Yeah. And FME, in lots of ways, makes that easy. With these processes like FME Server being able to run and consume different data sets. In the case of
it's actually your classic extract, transform, load.
Oh, it is. Yeah,
it's
integration of different.
But with it, little notifications firing everywhere depending on what you get back, and Yeah, it's a simple process. You could make it a whole lot bigger and better. It'd be just that
You put more error checking in place, more redundancy.
Well, I don't know if there's no need for more error checking.
Sorry, meaning internal workbench error checking. So
Yep.
you're obviously checking the input data,
yes.
but tidying up the logic and making it really clear and concise.
Well, I think one of the other things
robust.
is we've implemented certain things as they've come along,
and you've
but
just
actually
tacked it onto the side.
Added more addresses if they didn't match perfectly to an address on the thing, if they only matched at street level. But actually, half of those addresses now are reduced. So we did have 400 or 500 locations of interest, but now they're being taken off the list because they're now no longer seen as risks. So now we're down to 100 and something, I think, last time I checked.
Sounds about right.
And but I've still got all those other addresses in there. So actually, what we could do is build in a process that yes, they might come back, so maybe we don't, but we could build in a process that says these ones aren't used anymore, therefore tidy up your workspace.
Cool. Well, that was quite a chat.
Yeah.
It's really neat because we saw what was going on, Hamish and I did, and we kind of got the feel of what was going on, but to have more detail like that.
Well, we tagged along for a bit of the ride, and we're sort of there for if Todd for whatever reason couldn't do something, we were there
called COVID or something. Well, actually, it's I'm probably working away on this all the time.
And I think I also think it's interesting to talk about it as, it's a simple process when reality is we couldn't have done this process 5 years ago. I mean, maybe we could have, but it would have been completely not as easy as it is today.
It's not going to be out of the box.
Some of those things that we do on a weekly basis, daily basis, that really just hones a craft, and you're able to fire something up in a couple of days like that. And it just goes to show, you're pretty good with FME, and we all enjoy it enough that we just sit here and talk about it for 20 minutes.
And taking off the back of that, I've always said that of anything that I've done in FME, I could have done in Python. But there's a reason why I've chosen to do a lot of those things in FME, and it's because of the simplicity and the out-of-the-box nature.
Yeah.
So if you want to do something like that in Python, you'd have hundreds of lines of code. You'd have hundreds of if-else statements, whereas FME, you're just able to plonk a tester on, and suddenly you've got the ability to create multiple streams of data.
And when the new addresses come through, you don't have to go find the code. And when the new bus routes come through, they change the table format. You can just go to that area bookmarked out. Yeah. Because we do everything just perfectly annotated and bookmarked. And anyways, I think that's probably a pretty good chat there. And we'll close it off, and then we will see you next time. Once again, this is Abley Digital Engineering. That's Hamish, Todd, and I'm Gavin. We'll catch you next time.